Hello everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. The title of today's episode is Girl with a Pearl Earring, The Narcissism of Lost Meaning. There are a great many authors of the past who have survived centuries of oblivion and neglect, but it is still an open question whether they will be able to survive an entertaining version of what they have to say. So hi everybody, these are the key themes I'm going to look at today, and the overarching idea is the notion that art as we experience it today has a series of lost qualities because of the effects of the overarching society we live in. So this will be the first of a series of videos that will use both Girl with a Pearl Earring, which is one of the most famous and well-known pictures that nearly everybody has seen at least once, and also the theme I'll use as a shortcut, a Caravaggio painting of Narcissus, and that's just a shortcut to discuss the general theme of narcissism and how we understand it today, and how in some ways our understanding of narcissism today doesn't pay enough attention to the classical roots of where the word originally came from. So the first theme I want to get you to think about, and these aren't necessarily these themes in chronological order as I go through them. These are just the key themes that will pop up as I talk in this video and the next few. So reciprocity is one, and basically the most basic definition of reciprocity is just the idea that two people or two groups of people engage in acts of exchange with a view to mutual benefits, or most of the time both parties will mutually benefit from the relationship caused by this backwards and forwards, this aspect of reciprocity. Now, in our society, reciprocity is much less, it exists at a much lower level than it did in prior historical times. So there's a classical scholar called Richard Seaford who has done a number of studies of aspects of classical society in ancient Greece. And he points out, as I've read his work, in various stages, the way in which an average Greek person, ritual, interaction with your household gods or the whole society, the religion, the rituals, the theatre, the politics, everything was linked together in complex networks of reciprocity. Now, in our society, that's largely gone. Obviously, communities still exist. Obviously, some people are religious and have those rituals that give them a sense of belonging. But as a society in general, many of our formerly reciprocal rituals and social gatherings, etc., have been vastly diluted. So one obvious example would be commodities. In a commodity exchange, you buy a good or service, but the level of the relationship is much lower. So one of the bugbears I'll keep going on about in the next, all videos basically, as a recovering academic, I became increasingly disillusioned with the way in which education itself became a commercial exchange. So in the early days of my career, you'd engage with students and it felt like a form of vocation almost, without sounding too pompous. But towards the end, it was your satisfying customers, and your professional judgment is always subordinated to the demands of the customer, not the needs of a genuine student. So that's one example of the way to think about reciprocity. Another way would be the concept of enigma. So I'm going to show you a couple of paintings at least, and throughout the series a lot more, And an essential aspect of those paintings is that they're enigmatic. They're full of enigma. So we don't fully know, you the viewer do not fully know what they signify, what the meaning lying behind them is. And that's not your fault as a viewer. It's not the fault of the artist. Part of the enigma will be the artist or author in a work of art is trying to get you to think about things that are ultimately impossible to express fully, but they want to point you in a certain direction. So enigma's built in. The human condition is enigmatic. And artists obviously use their craft to exaggerate and play around with the enigmatic features of human experience. But again, in a commodity culture, a lot of what we experience has had the enigma taken out of it. And I think Girl with the Pearl Earring is a perfect example of that. So to give you an obvious cliched example, but a Hollywood movie, you'll all have had the experience. You settle down to watch a film, and in the first 5 minutes, you pretty much know what's going to happen, what the plot will be, the goodies, the baddies, how it will eventually all turn out for the best. And here's just a little quiz for you. If you ask yourself how many films you've ever watched that have a genuinely dispiriting, depressing ending. So even most, horrible, gory murder films, often the murderer will be caught. Or there'll be some type of closure for the family. But ask yourself how many films are really, at the end, they just send a message of absolute hopelessness. So off the top of my head, one film that always strikes me is the film Seven, with, I think it was Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. And I won't give away the ending in case people haven't seen it, but watch it. And I just think, what an absolutely amazing ending. It's so unusual. And the fact that, I could name, if it went on, I'd probably struggle to name more than 5 films of a similarly dispiriting ending. So, if not enigma, Hollywood produces a level of standardization where there is only one type of socially acceptable ending. So that just gives you a sense of how limited the range of artistic experience can be in a modern mass society. So the next I describe as Goldilocks and context. And why I refer to Goldilocks here is that when we look at the Girl with the Pearl Earring, which we will imminently, I'm just teasing you, I'm holding it back from you. But when we look at it, there is very little context in the painting itself. There's a blacked out background, and then there's the head of a girl, as the painting was previously historically known. And what's happened is mass media, mass commodity society struggles to deal with that lack of context. So without wishing to offend anyone who thoroughly enjoyed the international best-selling book Girl with a Pearl Earring or the follow-up movie, Hollywood, when it's presented with or mass media society, when it's presented with no context, has this overwhelming need to provide context when it shouldn't be provided, because the whole point of the work of art, Vermeer, is withholding meaning. And then the flip side of that is, when there's lots of complex context provided in a painting. So in Vermeer's, the vast majority of his other work, there was contextual information in his paintings. But on what Hollywood doesn't like that, the Hollywood mentality. So what you get with most artists is a heavily decaffeinated, decontextualized, overly simplified version of the original work of art. So the Goldilocks, for mass media society, there's either too much context or too little context. And mass media consumer society really struggles to get that Goldilocks just the right amount. And then I'll probably, as the order goes, I'll talk mostly or almost immediately about Touching the Void, which, for those of a particular mindset, was not the autobiography of a famous proctologist, but in fact, it actually refers to, I think, I came across the phrase, there may have been a book or a film about dangerous mountaineering. So I think that was called Touching the Void. It seems to stir memories in the deep, dark recesses of my senile brain. But Touching the Void is that what both Girl with a Pearl Earring and the Caravaggio Narcissus painting I'm going to show you, they might seem wildly disparate paintings, but I'd argue they both share the same quality. They're reaching across a divide. The look of the figures in the paintings are reaching across this human void it's really quite profound. And like I say, rather than dwell on the nature of that void, which is what Vermeer and Caravaggio do, our commodified society has to, like with the question of Enigma, our society feels this overriding need to take away the void and to fill it, to make the artwork more comfortable and more accessible in a really shallow way. But if the essence of the work of art is the void and being in touch with the void, the abyss of the human experience, the way in which commodity society decaffeinates things is very anti-art, which I'll be talking about a lot. So the painting Girl with a Pearl Earring, and here we are, it should be familiar to you all. And there's lots of subtlety for such a relatively simple painting. There's an awful lot of subtle complexity can be seen in this painting. So I'll talk about it in a second, but one of the overarching features is the colour scheme. So there's a contrast between the blue of the base of the turban, or the part of the turban that covers the girl's head nearest her eyes. Then there's the knotted part of the turban that's yellow. And then within the pendant, or the pendant that hangs down, you've got blue and yellow contrasted. And then obviously you've got the yellow house coat or whatever she's wearing with the white fringed collar. And in amongst all of that, you have the pearl, which is actually situated in the dark shadows obviously underneath the ear, but the nape of the neck is actually this quite dark area. And if I use the laser pointer, it's cleverly constructed. If you think of the line going down of the turban, so that directs our eyes as the viewer down to the earlobe. There's the angle of the eyes. They also end up at the earlobe. And then you've got the vertical, obviously, going down. And I think in the next video, I'll talk a lot more about the actual earring and its significance. But if you think of that as a clear vertical aspect, and it's mirrored slightly with the verticality of the hanging part of the turban. But again, the subtlety is that it's not as vertical as the earring, because it's falling downwards, but also it's moving to the right. And then you've got the earring also framed by the white collar. So the angle, it's like a triangle from that part of the turban, the eyes going across, and then also the eyes. We look at the pearl earring framed by this white collar as well. So I've mentioned the contrast between the blue and the golden yellow colour. There's the similarities and the contrasts between the vertical aspects. There's the similarity, obviously, both parts of the turban are attached to the girl's head, but the knot at the top is more tight That's where the knot is. That's where it all comes together. So it's tighter than the blue part of the turban, but at the same time there's another contrast because that knotted part of the turban also falls freely down. So it's tight and heavy up there, but it falls down with gravity, and there's lightness implied. Then you've got the shadow. You've got the light coming in from the left of the painting. You've got the shadow on the nose. You've got the light on the face, the shadow again on the cheek. Then you've got the shadow in the nape of the neck, and then you've got the light being caught by the yellow of the turban. So vertically there are contrasts, horizontally there are contrasts. You've got the reflection, so you've got the whites of the eyes, you've got the white reflection in the iris of the eyes, you've got the reflection in the earring, partly a little reflection of the collar, but the bigger reflection of the light coming in that mirrors, so to speak, the eyes and the light in the iris. So there's layers of mirroring. Then there's the contrast between the mouth and the eyes, because the eyes arguably they've been turned round to look at us. And I'd suggest that this is what I was mentioning before, the concept of enigma. It's not, I'd argue, and I hope you agree, it's not clear what those eyes are really saying. Has the girl been surprised as someone's walked in? Because the other aspect of the turban and the knottedness is that it's almost as if the face is swiveling whilst the knotted turban is keeping her head in place. So the face is turning on an axis towards us. But there's also a sense of rigidity provided by the turban. So the eyes are, is this someone looking at a lover? Is this someone surprised by someone? We don't know what the relationship is. And there's been pages and pages written by various art critics about the contrast between the eyes and the mouth. So the mouth is more, the adjective I'd probably choose is lubricious, which is a word to look up. But the mouth is more suggestive, I'd suggest, and acquiescent than the eyes. So that's an initial appreciation of I would argue an innately complex, an innately ambiguous, an innately enigmatic painting. And I mentioned earlier the background gives away nothing. So this was called a trony, this type of painting. It was a gesture painting. It wasn't supposed to be a realistic portrait of a particular person, like a lot of portraits were done on commission for particular people. So this may have had a model sitting, but it was more the artist using their imagination to encapsulate a particular type of face or gesture. And that was what a trony was. And there's about 30, I think there are 37 paintings now attributed to Vermeer. 4 of those were tronies like this. So the majority of his paintings actually had a fully developed background and context to them. Dutch household settings, or he had a beautiful painting called A View from Delft, which was the Delft riverfront. And I think that painting gets mentioned in Proust's La Recherche de Pompidou. There's a beautiful little sentence in Search of Lost Time where the narrator refers to, I think it's a beautiful bit of wall. The sun is glowing on this brick wall. And there's a character in Search of Lost Time who talks lovingly. That little bit of warm, sunlit wall has made a massive impact on him through his life. So Vermeer has this ability, even in seemingly innocuous paintings, to have this quite profound effect on people. So there, some of the... I'll get rid of this. That was my appreciation of the girl with the pearl earring, and I want to contrast it with this is the Caravaggio painting I mentioned. And I shouldn't have got rid of that pointer, but here we go back. In this painting, you can see the verticality of the eye going down. And this is the main theme of this painting that I think is relevant to the girl with the pearl earring. The look, the gaze. But in this instance, rather than the gaze looking at you, the viewer, across the void, this void between the viewer of painting, the easel, the surface of the painting that's looking back at you, which is obviously our suspension of disbelief. It's just a surface level image of a person, but we get this overwhelming sense of being looked back at. Whereas in this painting, the direction of the gaze is obviously Narcissus towards himself, and where we, the viewer, are not involved. The extent to which we are involved, it's this big phallic knee that's well lit coming out at us at the middle of the painting. And then you've got the scent that acts as the hub of the wheel. So if and when I look at Caravaggio in the future, there's a famous painting, the Conversion of St. Paul, where St. Paul is on the ground and his arms are outstretched, and there's a hoof of a horse, acts very similar to this painting as the central hub, around which this circularity, this sense of movement occurs. So on you can see here, the left, as we look at it, the arm is anchored, it's braced against the ground. There's this disappearing, it's quite angst-inducing, I'd suggest. It's quite poignant, the disappearing nature of the face. And Caravaggio was obviously famous for this Italian phrase, chiaroscuro, the use of light and darkness. So he uses the shade of the face to express the concept that Narcissus is looking at his face disappearing. He can't obtain the object of his desire because that object is himself. Although, importantly, in the myth, he didn't know that until the very end. So this idea, I'll talk about the modern adoption of the concept of narcissism, but it takes away a huge part of the significance and meaning of the original myth by assuming that Narcissus just fell in love with himself and always knew the reflection was of himself. So to me, the most fascinating part of the painting, or the most, not as part of a painting, it's not particularly fascinating, but it's just a detail that's very resonant, is this hand breaking the water. Because it's this surface of the water, this extremely thin film in which that acts as a screen, and the image that of Narcissus' own face exists beneath this very screen-like. It's incredibly ahead of its time, because if you think of this painting as a metaphor for modern screen culture, what's interesting is he's disturbing the screen, and the minute he does that in the myth, the image of himself is disturbed, but he's desperately trying to touch. This is the idea of touching the void. He's desperate to touch the image that he desires so deeply, but in the very act of touching, he gets further away. And this is I'll go into in future videos in quite a lot of length, the idea of desire as a relational concept. The irony about desire is that when you actually get what you desire, quite often you can no longer desire it. Like, I'm obsessed with food. If I get the food I'm hungry for, I'm satiated, at least momentarily, and I no longer desire it. So if you may, I think of the first flush of young love, and you've desired someone, you've borderline, pursued them to the edges of seductive propriety, and you finally get the great, object of your desire. And again, what Hollywood's not very good at is showing, in all these love stories it does, what if, well, they never show the person living with the person they've managed to get for the next 50, 60 years. because Hollywood can't deal with that. Hollywood shows the happy ending, but actually the happy ending is only really the happy beginning, because you don't see the rest of the full complexity of what a relationship would be if it lasted. And it always reminds me of the joke. There was two 90-year-olds who'd been married for 65 years or something, and they get divorced, and a local journalist, news reporter, asks them, you've been married for 65 years, why are you getting divorced? And they say, because we were waiting for the kids to die. Sorry, it's my sense of humour, but this idea of distance and desire, it's quite a complex relationship. Again, we're back to this idea of reciprocity. And this painting and the girl in a pearl earring are both about this concept of reciprocity. So on the theme of narcissism, and I'm arguing here, narcissism is not the same as Narcissus and the original myth. So to underline my theme that in a modern media society, we tend to empty artistic ideas of their inherent meaning. Ironically, the very use of the concept of narcissism in modern society is incredibly popular. If you go on the internet, massively popular subject area. But within the media, social media, etc., in which it's an incredibly popular topic, that mediation of the media, that's what the media do. They screen, they mediate. They've screened out the original meaning of the Narcissus myth. And I'm suggesting what I'll always be banging on about in these series of videos is the way in which paying close attention or appreciating art the way it should be appreciated, I think, with a bit of effort, with a bit of background knowledge if possible, and some openness to the reciprocity demanded of the viewer in a relationship with the artist who may be dead, but put all their creative soul into creating something that further down the line, many generations later, people could still enjoy a reciprocal relationship with. So the original use of the phrase, Freud really popularized the notion in 1914. I think the article was on Narcissism, an introduction, I think it was the title. But he got the idea, and he acknowledged this, from two people, Paul Nacke in 1889, who was a German psychiatrist, and Havelock Ellis, who was, I think he was English, who was a physician, psychologist. Now, Nacke and Ellis, they both they took the name Narcissus and they used the idea of narcissism strictly to describe someone who had a sexual fetish about themselves. So they used it in a very limited way. Excuse me, let's get some water. So they used it in a very limited way because the Narcissus myth is so much richer. And Freud added depth to just the basic definition of someone being sexually obsessed with themselves. To be fair to Freud, he added depth. But still, I'd argue, he didn't he just took the label without a lot of the nuance that actually comes with the original mythical idea. And in a future video, what I want to think or ask you to think about, and I'll explore, I honestly think the modern, not obsession, but the modern fascination with narcissistic personality disorder and notions of narcissism, actually Pygmalion, the myth of Pygmalion, would be much more appropriate. And again, it's because as a society, we've lost touch with the art of the classics. So the relevance of the Pygmalion story isn't fully appreciated or understood. So I won't go through the whole story, but the interesting thing about the Pygmalion myth is An artist creates a sculpture that he then falls in love with, and with the help of the gods, Narcissus in the Narcissus myth is punished by the gods. But in the Pygmalion myth, he's rewarded, this artist is rewarded by his statue coming alive. Now, what the Narcissus myth is all about is the relationship of someone to themselves in a much more complex way than Freud acknowledged. Whereas, so it's about them and their own ego. Pygmalion is about enjoying, inverted commas, or relating to somebody else in a highly objectified form. You know, it couldn't be much more objectified than a statue. Pygmalion treats this inert statue and loves it so much, he wants it to come alive. But I'd argue that's about the desire to control somebody else's ego. So in the original myth, Narcissus, why he annoys so many people is that he's so self-sufficient. He doesn't need anyone else. And when he's looking at his own reflection, and even when he eventually does find out it's he himself he's seeing in reflection, he then still wants just to be with himself. So you could argue in a certain sense he's not doing anyone any harm. He's just, really, really obsessed with himself. Whereas Pygmalion, his idea of a dream woman is a woman who he has created not in his own image, but in an image that satisfies him. And that desire, or at least metaphorically, to control somebody else or to have someone be your ideal rather than an actual independent, free-spirited person. A, I think that's much more disturbing. B, I think it's actually a lot more relevant to modern notions of narcissistic personality disorder. And this is just to give you a sense of how far back, I'll give you an even earlier one in a second, but this is to give you a sense of how far back concepts of narcissism go. So I'm trying to, from memory, I think Ovid's, the original Narcissus myth in the Metamorphoses, I think it was written, I'll check this out, but I think it was written about 8 AD. And approximately round about that time, in the reign of Emperor Augustus, there was this character, Hostius Quadra. Now, if you remember anything about the Spartacus movie, the big Spartacus rebellion, the Romans as a society were quite understandably obsessed about the disproportionate numbers. So the Romans were incredibly powerful, but the disproportionate number of slaves that were needed for Roman society to function meant that if the slaves ever rose up, it's like science fiction movies about the robots rising up against us. But in Roman society, if the slaves ever did rise up, obviously the Romans were incredibly vulnerable to this. So in Roman society, any type of slave rebellion was absolutely crushed. So at a domestic level, if ever domestic servants were found guilty of murdering their master, the penalties were extremely harsh. Well, this Hostius Quadra was I'm trying to think of a modern word for him. He was basically a deviant, although I'd argue in modern times, finding something that now qualifies as deviant, the levels seem to be going ever more subterranean as to what would qualify for deviancy. But he was a sexual deviant who had a bedroom, like a sex den, that was covered in mirrors. And I'm not sure whether it was deliberately done or because the nature of mirrors in those times was so basic. They had a distorting effect, so Hostia Quadra could see himself being penetrated in various perverse ways with all these partners. He liked very large, well-endowed men, apparently. And he would look at himself, and generally he was such a deviant that eventually his servants murdered him. And I've just explained how, this was a massive issue in Roman times, but he was so deviant that the Emperor Augustus didn't have the servants killed, because he just thought he basically deserves it. So that's how bad he must have been, that the slaves weren't killed. And then you have this is from Plato's Phaedrus. So this is, approximately 370 BC. But in Plato's Phaedrus, there's a discussion about the nature of love. And for the Greeks, the highest form of love was homosexual love, but not generally between two equal-aged men, but between a mentor-type character and their young mentee. And in the Phaedrus, there's this discussion. And part of it, Plato's describing how one aspect of being in love is that you enjoy the fact that you can see yourself in the gaze of the person who loves you. So even when you're in a relationship with other people, Plato was conscious of the fact that actually there's a narcissistic element even in your relationship to somebody else, because you like to see reflected back to you your best features as perceived by someone else. So why does someone love me? Well, you see glimpses of it back in their eyes. So he is seeing himself as in a mirror, which is very much an accurate description of that Caravaggio painting. So this just gives you a sense of some of the layers of meaning to be found in the notion of narcissism. So to take that and to then move on to pursue the idea of touching the void. Paul Klee spoke of a moment in the act of painting when the free inspiration of the artist must yield to the demands of the thing coming into being. He described it as the moment in which the painting acquired a face. Now it looks at me, he would declare. But in Head of a Young Woman, it is as if Vermeer undertakes to paint this threshold and prolong the act of looking back across a void. So this is from a book called A Study of Vermeer by Edward Snow, and it's he does a whole chapter on what he calls the head of a young woman, in other words, girl with a pearl earring. And it's a stunningly good book, and this is a brilliant chapter on this one particular painting. But the things I'd like to emphasize in this quotation: the artist must yield to the demands of the thing coming into being. Coming into being. In future videos, I want to explore the existentialist and the phenomenology approach to the notion of being, what it is to exist as a human being. And one of the themes in existentialism and phenomenology is the quality. It's interesting that we are called human beings. There's an active verb to describe the noun, the human. So the verb is incorporated into the noun. We are human beings. And this concept of being, it sounds so obvious because we all exist. But actually, this is what these philosophies seek to explore. And in this painting, this is what fascinates me, is where philosophical ideas meet visual representations of certain ideas. And this coming into being of another person's gaze. We can never know what goes on inside someone else's head. There's this void between human beings that's just part of existence. And what Vermeer is trying to do is actually paint what's referred to here by Edward Snow as this threshold. This gap that exists between two people looking at each other, that can never be fully bridged because we're separate human beings, and our being is separate to another being although we're all contained in the general existence that you can also call being with a capital B. So that all sounds very, very wordy, and that's one of the reasons I want to keep using art, because the act of looking back across a void. So there's various phenomenological, Lacanian, psychoanalytical, existentialist. There's lots of complex philosophical and theoretical ways of looking at the notion of the void between human beings. But arguably, Girl with the Pearl Earring encapsulates with brilliant artistic brevity the nature of that void. So back to the painting. I hope you can now see, looking at it again, you know, if this talk is any use, I'm hoping that you will see that painting slightly differently now, with some of that background information or way of looking at it. And just to give an example of the skill with which Vermeer uses just something as simple as colour. This is what, and I to be honest, I'm sure there'll be some viewers who really do like abstract art. I struggle with it. But this is Vasily Kandinsky, you know, an amazing abstract artist. And this is what he said about colour. If two circles are painted respectively yellow and blue, brief concentration will reveal in the yellow a spreading movement out from the centre and a noticeable approach to the spectator. The blue, on the other hand, moves in upon itself like a snail retreating into its shell and draws away from the spectator. So I just think that's Vasily Kandinsky writing about blue and yellow. And if you go back and look at that painting, the things I was saying about the turban, I just think that description fits wonderfully. The actual Girl with the Pearl Earring painting. So Vasily Kandinsky was an abstract painter. He's talking here in quite abstract terms about colour. And why I think the Vermeer painting is just so fascinating is that it puts into, almost tangible visuality what Kandinsky's talking about here quite abstractly. So her eyes, especially in Sartre's work and also in Lacan's psychoanalytical work, there's this concept of the look. And it's a while since I've read Sartre, but I will go back and do my homework before using him in detail when I look at the actual topic very, very closely about the notion of the look. But the eyes have it. I will be looking in the next video in detail at the relationship, the metaphorical relationship between the eyes in the Vermeer painting of the Girl with the Pearl Earring and the earring itself. But this concept, eyes, it's the way in which just these little globules of jelly-like substance can contain within them. You know, they say the eyes are the mirror of the soul. But also the way in which, if someone looks at you lovingly or someone looks at you with contempt, the subtlety of just a look and how physiologically that can be contained within an eye. I think that's what is so stunningly impressive about the Vermeer painting. He can get some of that enigmatic quality about a look. And the look in Sartre, he describes it at one point, I seem to remember, whereby, let's imagine you're spying on someone through a keyhole. And my voice reminded me then of Lloyd Grossman, through the keyhole. But if you're looking through a keyhole at two people or one person in another room, and they don't know you're looking at them, so you're a voyeur. Now, your sense of self is pretty unreflective because you're not thinking about yourself as a human being. Most of your sense of self at that point when you're looking through a keyhole is concentrated on the act of looking at somebody else. So your sense of self, you're not really aware of yourself in the world. More so, you're aware of just looking. It's the act of looking takes up all your concentration. So to yourself, you just feel like pure vision. And the other person in the room that you're spying on, they are pure object because they're not having a reciprocal relationship at that moment with you. They are, for you, just an object to be spied on. Now, if whilst you're looking through that keyhole, someone walks along the corridor and sees you, you then become an object for that person. And also more so, not just an object, your sense of self can instantaneously change. You're most likely to feel some type of guilt or shame that you've been found to be looking at somebody else. And suddenly the tables are turned. So in the first instance, you're looking at someone in a room and they don't know. So the look is one way. It's not reciprocated. And that gives you voyeuristic pleasure. When someone takes you by surprise, perhaps like in Girl with a Pearl Earring, we don't know the reason why she's turned. But if you're taken by surprise, in that instance, you become an object for somebody else. And your act of looking becomes a source of shame that is caught by somebody else looking at you looking. So these are the complex layers. The minute you start to explore the nature of being in relationship to sight and the look. But again, this is Edward Snow's work. And again, this is about head of a young girl. Her eyes sharpen the underlying mood into something poignant and piercing, and focus it on the artist viewer with a mixture of reproach and regret that isolates and utterly discloses him. Her eyes accuse, yet have compassion, offer consolation, yet give expression to the very wishes of which the heart despairs. They capture the present instant in the foreground and expand it, yet at the same time signal to us from the distance into which she already recedes. And again, I just think why I'm being so reliant upon, I believe if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I just couldn't express, I couldn't put into words what Vermeer's doing as eloquently as that. I just think it's, Edward Snow's a beautiful writer. So what he's highlighting in this quotation is the mix between and the contrast, the mix and contrast, that her eyes accuse, yet have compassion, offer consolation, yet give expression to the very wishes of which the heart despairs. So we're back to the concept of enigma, and the contrasting expression is reinforced, or the way in which the painting, the various contrasts I pointed out, little details that contrast with each other. The overall effect of the whole painting is the contrasting expression, the ambiguity, the enigma in the expression is undergirded, it's reinforced by the various contrasts across and throughout the painting itself. So everything, the expression, the content, the substantive message of the painting is reinforced by the technical details of how Vermeer has painted it. And this is just, I mentioned Lacan earlier. Objet petit is, in French, literally object small a, or little object a, as it's known. And it's what it means is it's indefinable. So This is Lacan. When in love, I solicit a look. What is profoundly unsatisfying and always missing is that you never look at me from the place from which I see you. So this is, again, this is the profoundly enigmatic nature of what it is to be a human being and gaze or be gazed at. There's always this void, this gap, and the ultimate impossibility. You never look at me from the place from which I see you. So back to Edward Snow, but I think this is a similar point. Head of a young girl makes us feel this moment. So this crucial phrase, the meeting of identical gazes, the being looked at from one's place of longing, and at the same time experience its absolute impossibility. So that's the essential ambiguity. That is the essential way in which Vermeer is trying to achieve the impossible. So the painting is a glorious failure. And it's a failure not through any fault of Vermeer, but he's trying to, he comes as close to expressing, I'd argue, what cannot be expressed. Head of a young girl makes us feel this moment, the meeting of identical gazes, the being looked at from one's place of longing, and at the same time experience its absolute impossibility. So the enigmatic nature of looking at another person is somehow encapsulated and portrayed on just a canvas, which I just find, that is the beauty and limitation of art. The beauty of the art comes from the limitation. You're daubing paint onto a canvas, and yet you're getting close to the impossible. You almost manage to convey the gap that exists between human beings, even at their closest. So I'll finish with this. We're back to the Caravaggio painting. If you go back to that as we look at it, his left hand, but we're looking at it, it's on the right-hand side for us. Rather than another person, this is Narcissus. In the actual original, in Ovid's text, he actually exclaims how he would love to be not distant from himself. He's caught in this, I've forgotten the exact phrase, but he's caught in this intractable bind whereby he wants to leave his own body so that he can have this relationship with his own reflection. But he obviously can't do that. You can't leave your own body. So he's in this eternal, as the hand tries to touch the thing that can never be touched. Because he can't, the minute you go through that screen and try and touch your reflection, the surface level of the water gets disturbed and the image disappears. Just like if you narrow the distance between you and the object of your desire too much, it stops being desire. And you turn into the 90-year-olds about to get divorced after 65 years together. So this touching the void, that's what that hand on the right-hand side, as we look at it, depicts. And I'll just leave it at that for now, but I'll be coming back to this concept of narcissism. Because in this Caravaggio painting, this is a much fuller depiction of what Narcissus himself in the myth is going through. It actually relates to the nature of desire in general. And we, as a mass media society, have taken this very complex idea of what it is to be desired, what it is to see yourself in a reflection, in this case, of himself, but also, as Plato pointed out, in the eyes of somebody else. There's these enigmatic questions that art engages in battles to answer, but it never can fully. But all that complexity, all those layers of meaning, in the modern use of the word narcissistic, all we've done is reduce it to the definition of somebody who loves themselves. And I'd argue, in a sense, that is what a narcissistic society does. It reduces everything to a very narrow circular, as you can see in that painting. A very narrow circular, snake eating its own tail. Ouroboros, I think it's called. This mythical figure of the snake eating its own tail. So in the next video, I'll explore more about the implications of this for a society of, I call it narcissistic social order, rather than narcissistic personality disorder, narcissistic social order. Because, as I've tried to show throughout this talk, the society we live in simplifies the layers of complexity that exist in that and paintings like Girl with a Pearl Earring. So, until the next time, and thank you for your attention and watching for this long, and I'll see you soon. All the very best.